And now I will turn the floor to our president of the Swedish
Swedish Patient Organization,
yes.
Svenska Reumatikerförbundet.
Karl Rombo, also of course involved in the European Science Federation for Care of the Newborn.
The EFCNI,
yeah.
I mean, yes, exactly. The European Federation for the Care of Newborn Infants, I think. We will move to the other end of the line, so to speak. I want you to prepare for 30 minutes of non-evidence-based information. Now, no, this is not mine. This is mine. Because today I won't talk about any sort of scientific things. I won't talk about political issues or advocacy work. I will focus mainly on emotions and 30 minutes on my subjective story. But I've come to realize when meeting a lot of parents, actually all over Europe, that our stories are strikingly similar. And I think that my story will reflect a lot of other parents as well, and I will try to bring those stories in as well. Actually, my daughter is born in 2010, and it sort of strikes me when listening to you how far we've got already. This might, for some of you, this might be like going back in time and say, yeah, that's where we were, and now we're on the right track, or you will feel like you're getting something new. How is it going? Yes, vänta, I know. It's this one. Yeah. Perfect. Sometimes I start my lectures by asking a simple question, which for the first time I think all of you in here know the answer to. Why do we have parents in the NICU? And I get a lot of different answers, but in here it's like obvious. Still, I think we have to reflect on the fact that if we're needing the parents and if we are using the parents, we also have to make sure that the parents get through this period in their lives as whole as possible. And we have to help them not just reconnect to their, or bond to their children, but also reconnect to their society, to their family and friends, and also actually to each other, which I will come to. My story starts in 2010, in December. My wife had been quite tired during our second pregnancy, and she had some contractions. And as we were going to the Canary Islands for a Christmas holiday, we thought it might be good to have her checked up. So we went to the maternity care, and she was examined, but no blood tests were taken, no ultrasound. So she got the response that you're just being stressed out. It might be good for you to go to the Canary Islands to rest for a while. So we went away. And here is my son. He's not prematurely born at all. He was born in 40 plus 1, weighing 3.5 kilos. And he's on top of the world right now. He's moving so fast that I couldn't even focus on the camera. You know, he gets his full attention from both his parents. And little does he know that he's going to have a sister in 4 days. And neither does the guy behind the camera either. Well, on the flight home, the contractions got worse, and I was quite happy that it was a direct flight. 24 hours after we landed, my wife had a small bleeding, and we went to the hospital to have it checked up. And little did we know, again, that we wouldn't return the three of us until 4 months later. Home. My wife was transferred to Karolinska Solna, this hospital, the very same night, and she had a cervix insufficiency, and I spent the day after with her at the hospital. But then I went home to catch my son from daycare, and she suddenly called me, screaming that the baby's coming, you have to come here soon. And I rushed to the hospital, and I got there in time to have a quick talk with the neonatologist, and he told me that the baby was going to be very, very small, very sick, and possibly quiet. And when I asked him about the chances of survival, he said around 50-50. But when I asked him about the chances of survival without any disability, he said it was around 20%. And for me, those odds were far too bad. I was using calculating risks in 1 in a million. You know, like, should we go with Norwegian or Scandinavian Airlines to the Canary Islands? And here we had something completely different. So I told him, like, if you're in a situation when you get to save her with disability or letting her go, we just want you to let her go. 20 minutes later, my daughter was born the normal way, of course, and I even got to cut the navel cord. And then we went off to the emergency room. And the same thing, when seeing her lying there, so small, struggling, her Apgar points were all 0, I couldn't believe that this would sort of end well. So I begged to God for the first time in my life, just, okay, take her home. You know, we've seen her, so that we can go home and continue the life that we were living. We already have had a son, and sort of we can try to be pregnant again. And of course, that is something I felt guilty for since then, that I didn't stand up for my child at that time. But of course, you understand that our life was quite fragile. We were both freelancing singers. We weren't prepared for that at all. Fortunately, the doctors thought otherwise, so they took her up to the NICU. They intubated her, which I'm grateful for ever since. My daughter was everything but stable the first weeks. She had a severe RDS and an infection, and I got increasingly annoyed with the staff greeting me for having a daughter. I said, well, how can you greet me for being in such an awkward place? But slowly the words kept sinking in, and I started to engage in her care, changing diapers, changing blankets, learned how she wanted to lie, how she was feeling. And I started to realize that I was actually the father of 2 children and not just 1. It became my first bonding process with my daughter. I would say it was a substitutory one, but still I was feeling like a parent. But bonding with her also meant that seeing her being ill got increasingly difficult. Every time her saturation dropped, every time she had life support, we did what most parents do in that situation, that we braced ourselves. We steeled ourselves and just hoped for the best and expected the worst. And we got like almost disconnected from the reality, encapsulated. On the outside, we seemed quite normal and functioning, but on the inside, it was like a total chaos. And I was happy with that in a way. I didn't think that anyone would like to meet that person inside, and I didn't want to meet that person either at that time. But that sort of armor that we created had a large backside, that when we got home and were supposed to interact with our daughter again, that armor was incredibly hard to take off. And I used to define, in a way, that time at the NICU in how thick that armor was. And of course, there were things that made that armor thinner or thicker. And one thing that made me become more present was, of course, being skin on skin with my daughter. Those sort of endless hours, we didn't have any iPads, no iPhones, no books, just her and me, keeping her warm. We fell asleep, waking up again. That created a very special bond. It's something that has sort of made me being able to reconcile with that period ever since. Something else that also helped a lot was the interaction with the staff. I think psychological counseling is invaluable, is extremely important, of course. But the breakdowns, you know, they don't come by schedule, so we couldn't decide whether we're going to break down at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. So when we were standing by the incubator changing diapers or at night and tears came trickling down and I think I can't do this anymore, there was always someone there to pick us up in such a good and in such a professional way. And to sort of take our sorrows on as they came were invaluable. And I've seen that by coincidence at a spinal clinic here in Sweden, where all the personnel were educated in Socratic dialogue to be able to talk with the patients in a more structured way. And I don't know if that method is like the perfect one, but I still think that emotional support is very good if it's done in sort of that way as well. And the same thing goes, of course, that taking part in my daughter's care was extremely important. But there were, of course, things that made that armor being thicker as well. And one thing that I get from a lot of parents when I talk to them is change. That change is hard. And that doesn't matter if it's changes for the worst or for the better. It's just change. Being in sort of that insecure environment makes you bond and cling on to a lot of things. And that can be incubators, a special room, a care medical routine, an ordination, and especially, of course, doctors and nurses. And any changes of that will always trigger a response of, oh, I have to brace myself for what is to come. And we can't avoid change. After all, we want change to happen, especially changes for the better. But I think one key factor here is always time. And for all of those changes, that doesn't have to go fast, because we all know there are a lot of changes that have to go fast. Time is crucial. And if we can inform the parents and then give them a little bit of time to let things sink in, then come back to you with questions and then perform change, you will not trigger, I think, that sort of fear response as much. I think it's a very good way. One example of how irrational those feelings of fear of change can be is when we were supposed to take my daughter out to CPAP. That was a change for the better, of course. But I was terrified. I thought, well, she's going to die, and why don't we keep her in there for 2 more weeks? And she grows, she will be a lot bigger, and she will handle that a lot better. And actually, I managed to postpone that withdrawal for 2 days. But then the 3rd day, the nurse came and said, well, Kalle, today was going to weigh your daughter, and we think we would like to do that without the CPAP on. So could you please reconsider, in a way? And I said, okay, let's do it. So we took off the monitoring, we took off the cap, and then finally the CPAP. And I saw her lying there on the scale, and it was fantastic, of course. But all I could think of was put the monitoring back on. And they said, well, let's sit skin on skin with her for a while. You can see that she's fine. Her skin color is great. Just hold her. And I was sitting there for 3 minutes and then begged again, could you please put the monitoring back on? Because I want to know how she is. And that was the way, even though I was net-capped, that was the way I sort of wanted to know how she was by looking at the saturation value. And they put the monitoring back on, and the numbers came up, and it was 98 to 100%. It was better than it ever been before. So she was so happy to get rid of that CPAP. And for me, that was the first real moment of happiness. It was like she was born again. She actually took breaths of her own, more than 2. And that was a milestone. And the only thing I regret that was my wife wasn't there to share that moment with me. Well, that story tells us another thing on how to approach a parent who has got locked up in some kind of emotional state. That in that armor, it was very easy to get into conflicts. And it could be about things that was before I didn't care, or that I didn't care about afterwards, but in that place triggered an emotional response that made me lock up a bit. And you know how it is when you get emotionally locked up and someone is totally irrational by your side, you get really sort of ashamed of yourself. And I've seen so many times that persons are trying to reach out to those patients by banging the rational arguments sort of against their total bubble of emotion, and they get totally cornered. And of course, it's just better to back off a little bit, let the person calm down, and then come back to gain confidence. And that's exactly what they did. And it's so easy. Everyone of you knows this from all of your relationships, but it's worth mentioning. Something else that always complicates the interactions between staff and patients in the NICU is, of course, the inequality in status. And that goes, of course, with a normal patient and doctor meeting, but now we are prolonging it to 3.5 months. And I was an opera singer at that time. I was used to people knowing a little bit of who I was, at least those who were interested in modern, contemporary Swedish opera. But there I was just by myself, a parent, nothing more. And I was confronted with sort of myself as well, with all these existential questions, wondering about in those slippers and the robe. But interacting with people that are wonderfully secure in their professional roles, which you all should be, that's fantastic, creates a lot of problems. And I don't have any solution to that when nurses say, well, how shall I approach that sort of private side of my patients? But I think that's why one part why patient interaction in the NICU is so incredibly important, that that interaction creates a bridge between the outer normal world and their normal identities to the ones in the hospital. So they sort of get a feel of being themselves again. Sorry. My daughters went through the first months without any severe complications, and we got to go home actually 2 weeks before her due dates. And I thought it was fantastic to come home. I was really looking forward to that, but at the same time I was terrified. I wanted to spend all the energy I had on being with my daughter. Instead, which could be a topic for another presentation, I had to fight a lot, I think, to make her needs met. And that could go with handling unresponsive family and friend members who didn't understand that she was sensitive to infections, and that could be people in child healthcare service who weren't informed. And in a total, that created a sense of isolation and loneliness. But I think the hardest part and the biggest challenge in this period was to bond with my daughter and leave the healthcare behind. And we were doing our best being the primary sort of caregivers, but we were doing in the way of being the primary health caregivers. We were designing our bedroom. We were adjusting the bed with straps so we can adjust the angle she was lying in. We were creating small baby nests. We were doing this sort of with like a small tent to shelter her from impressions. And we took the breathing monitor, put it on her belly, and then put the sort of apparatus on the wall beside. Then we said, oh, this is perfect. This is just like home at the hospital. Great. Except, of course, that didn't work out very well in the long run. She became, in a way, like a medical project. It was like I couldn't look at her without having my thoughts continuously spinning, observing, monitoring her. What is coming up? Is there any sort of abnormalities? Is she behaving in the right way? And it went so far that I actually couldn't sort of see her and take her in. And I wrote a couple of words about that when I came home. I will tell you in English. I laid my eyes on you today, but I didn't see you. You were there, but your reflection within me kept escaping. I tried again. I swear, I dared to look right at you, and yet I only saw the bed you were lying in and the sheets you were lying on. I must get closer. If I lay myself beside you, so close that I can hear you, the sound in you that says you're still alive, my heart just beside yours, and only with a little spin of skin and pajamas in between. There you take place within me, and I cry and care about you. So I couldn't actually see the amazing thing that was going on in front of my eyes, that she was bonding, developing, and starting to love us. And it's important to stress, especially in this room, that this was not because we had engaged so much in her care or that we were NID-capped. This was because we didn't have enough of a medical follow-up. We had a medical follow-up, but we didn't have enough of medical follow-up, so we took a medical responsibility. It was also because this armor that I was talking about earlier was so thick. I had so many times gotten used to the thought of losing my child that I couldn't dare to think that he would stay. So that was the process, my second bonding process, so to speak. The first one, I became the caregiver. The second one, I had to open up for her loving me. When she was knocking on my door, I wasn't there. For her to create a second bonding process, she needed me to be present. And that has become my lodestar, so to speak, since then, that all the parents have to have a proper medical follow-up. Their sheltering and their armor should be as thin as possible in order for them to bond with their babies. They should be helped to reconnect with their society and with the family and friends, and also with each other. And this could also be the topic for a whole new presentation, I think. But after 2.5 years, my wife and I got divorced. And I think you all seen some of the studies showing that it's not that uncommon. Just a caution, causality, but in our room, 3 of the 4 families present divorced, sort of like 2.5 years after homecoming. And I've said that, I wrote in a blog once that when you enter the NICU and you disinfect your hands, you take off your rings. You're entering like 2 individuals quite often. It's hard to support each other when both are in crisis. It's very hard to show physical intimacy in an hospital environment. You know, there are family rooms, but I don't know what's going on in the family rooms, but I don't think, not much, unfortunately. And I think we could gain a lot by trying to help the parents to acknowledge what they've gone through, what their thoughts were their reactions, so to speak, and try to understand that and try to leave that behind them when they go home. I know that my first response was just talking. And my wife's response was mourning a lost pregnancy and just wanted me to shut up. And then when we came home one year after, it was like, where were you when I needed you? So that is something to think of, I think, in the future. This is my daughter this summer. She is 5.5 years old. When she calls me today, she gets my attention, at least the proper amount of attention, I think. When she was 1 year old, we discovered that she had a cerebral palsy in her right side. And it's fascinating how I reacted then compared to how I reacted 4 months earlier. That I didn't want to run away at all. I wanted her sort of to train. I wanted to do the best for her. And she's shown that when trained the right way, her brain has been enormously adaptive, and her will to heal is enormous. And I think that goes with all of the children that we work with and all of the parents. And we should take care of that power and not let it be drenched in fear. And I think that old wisdom that it's not the one that screamed the most that we should worry about, it's the one that's quiet, goes with all the premature babies, the teenagers, and the parents as well. But I will leave you with one final take-home message for today, that it's fantastic to be here and see the progress since I had my baby in the last 5 years. I think that neonatology isn't anymore about saving tiny babies, but saving big families. So thank you.
Well, fantastic presentation. Please stay. There might be some questions or comments from the audience. We have a couple of minutes. If you want to take an opportunity to discuss, or
we can do it later on as well.
We can do it later as well.
Karl, can I just ask you something? It really struck me. I've written it down here when you talked about the inequality of status.
Yeah.
Because we were talking earlier on about the difficulties sometimes of engaging some families, and I've always felt that this might be one of the issues for families, is this what I think you're describing as the inequality of status. Do you want to just talk a bit more about that?
You mean that the families have problems of daring to engage in the care?
Or feeling that the staff have all the power, and that their status is so vulnerable because they don't have any power and I'm not quite sure if that's what you meant or not, but
It's not really what I meant. I mean that everyone has like a professional identity as well, a professional status, and I think many of us are quite connected to that one. And being in the hospital, we're sort of totally deprived of that professional status. I mean, no one cares whether you're working in a bank, whether you're driving a truck, whether you're an opera singer, you're just a parent, and you're quite you're not used to being in that situation. Compared to the other ones, the doctors and nurses are really confident in their sort of professional identities. But of course, if you are if everyone is radiating that sort of confidence and you're not confident yourself, you will sort of give over the care, of course, to the nurses and doctors. And I think it's important to be very fast with empowering the parents in the care, so that they never get the impression that the nurses and the doctors are the primary caregivers. I think there's like a window of, I don't know how long it is, if it's 24 or 48 hours, who knows, but it should be really, really fast. And the more we can stress that they can do something to their babies that the nurses and doctors actually can't, I think they will realize that they will be important.
Very, very nice presentation. I enjoyed it every minute. You told us when they removed the CPAP, you felt happiness. Have you thought about that? Why did you feel happy? Did you get more confident, or did you trust your baby in another way, or why was that a moment of happiness?
It was just that sense of happiness that I experienced with my firstborn child. When he arrived and we sort of had him on our breast, we felt this immense happiness of having a baby. It's called baby happiness in Swedish, babylycka. And that was the first time, actually, that I felt that kind of happiness, that it wasn't connected to something that was, a disclaimer around it, that something could go wrong and something. I could sort of trust in that this was actually going to work, in a way. And because she was doing it on her own. And I mean, in all this, I think you had the discussion this morning, the baby is, of course, the central part. Nothing can beat the rehabilitation of the parents more than their baby actually developing and getting healthy. That is like the main thing. If that happens, I think most of the things around will solve itself, but still.
It's very interesting because I think it's very important for us to be aware of that, to create these moments.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for this very impressive presentation. I wonder, you said like there was a gap between hospitalization and then afterwards when you were at home and you felt kind of lonely without medical follow-up. I mean, what would you have, what do you think the needs are when you have been discharged?
I think that gap goes with all the parents that I speak of, and that regardless, actually, if they have a very good medical follow-up or not, in a way. But it is a big change, and it will be. And we had so much coordinating business as well. We had a lot of caregivers of different places, and it was like we were in charge. And the more you can feel like the medical responsibility is somewhere else, that there will be a checkup and so on, the more you can be yourself. But I also think that at this time we didn't have much of a rehabilitation process. So we weren't NID-capped in that sense, that we were sort of learning how to cope with everything by ourselves. So that would have helped a lot, I think, if we gradually would sort of have been taken out of hospital, learning to have the responsibility by ourselves, and then finally taking the responsibility, of course.
Thank you, Karl, for this very, very nice and I would say touchy presentation with lots of emotion, and it's always very important for us to hear about what parents things. And so I have a question about you mentioned about separation between parents and divorce, and my question is what could the teams do more in order to prevent that, and what would be your advice or your feeling about that, because you were in an environment where as compared to France, where parents can stay together in the same room in Sweden, and so my question is more what would be your feeling about that?
My reflection has also been that when looking at other countries, I can't imagine how hard it must be for a mother to come home and try to explain to her husband what she's gone through. Compared to what we've experienced, that gap must be huge. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, makes things easier or harder, but it's something I've also thought about, of course. For Swedish conditions, I just thought that, I don't know, somehow stressing that sort of the importance of the relationship without getting too private. But in every decision and trying to enhance the communication between the parents as well. I mean, I felt very empowered as a father, actually, maybe more than my wife did. I took a lot of responsibility. But this thought has been growing in my head. I hope someone will do something about it, that this kind of emotional closure, that you go through the process before you go home and try to acknowledge what you've gone through. Not necessarily understand, just sort of see and acknowledge, and then try to lie that behind you, so that you don't end up in that loop. What was going on? Where were you? Then they are, a lot of parents they're keeping score when they get home, like after a year, starting to think, well, where were you when I needed you? He didn't take out the dishes today. Okay, maybe he isn't there for me now either. And how much, and then it just goes on and on and on, and you create some kind of loop. So, I don't know. It's a good question. I'm sorry if I can't answer it properly.
Yeah, my babies were not that premature, but I can feel it's 13 years ago for me, but I can feel still
the same thing.
What do you think about getting information in percent? Also, you got the information. The chance is 50-50. I think I got that information, and I had nearly, was finished with medicine studies. I couldn't get the information out of what did it mean. It hadn't any meaning, because afterwards I know it became good. It was no problem, but it was very stressy to get that information, and I think that's my opinion. What do you think? Because you told you've got the information 50-50, and that is a catastrophe, maybe.
Yeah. Well, now I think it would have been better odds, but there's a whole science of this risk analysis and risk sort of communication, of course. Of course, it's better to always stress the chances than the risks. Of course, it's nice to say that there's an 80% chance of your baby surviving without a disability. I know there's a coffee break coming. Okay.
I think we have to be much better informing, because you are talking about group statistics. And when your child is born, it's an individual case. And you cannot actually go back to group statistics and say that's the answer, I think. I think that's the most challenging part for us, health professionals, try to talk about statistics on the group level, but still give hope for the individual family, individual infant, because you would never know if that would be which side of the 50-50% or which side of the 20-80%. So but it is challenging.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do we have any more comments about how to deal with these emotionals during the hospital stay from any of the psychologists, or no?
Did you see a psychologist?
We do have psychologists in our units in Sweden, not as many as they do in France or in Italy, but...
I have a comment about this, about the sort of 2 years after thing, because I have observed this a lot. And it also happened in my family with my son after twins who were born not very prematurely. And what I see happening quite a lot, particularly with fathers, that it's a year, 18 months, 2 years. In my son's case, he became severely depressed. And that put a huge strain on the marriage. It has survived, but it was very difficult. And I've used to follow families up at home quite closely. And I noticed this a lot, that there would seem like the crisis period and the father would be supporting the mother a great deal, and then you were through the crisis, and then he'd fall apart, and then the marriage would get into difficulties. And I think it's something that we simply don't put in place any kind of preparation for that or any support through that. And I think you're absolutely right, it's really important. I'm not sure about whether you can achieve closure before you leave, but there's often nowhere to take it, and you're just left struggling on your own, and that's what I see happening a lot.
Yeah, it's a very nice analysis. And I had a severe PTSD, of course, but I think that's, as I've seen, that might be when that's sort of over with and you go back to normal life, that's when the divorce happens. Not during the depression in itself, but when you get back.
Yeah, I'm Karin Stjernqvist, and I've been working as a clinical psychologist on a NICU for 10 to 15 years. And I have been trying on many different levels that it should be a regular thing to have a psychologist in a NICU. But with the cutting downs, even the position I former had has been taken away. So I think, we need to hear from the parents how essential it is to be able to to discuss the situation even during the time the child is that ill and you are so anxious as parents. So, but I don't know where to lob. I have been lobbying in many different arenas. So join me in the association of the premature parents.
I think we have to finish this. Thank you very, very much. And we
You're
can
welcome.
come back to